So back in the end of March, we actually had three generations of Uyematsus on a Zoom call at that time, on a Zoom board meeting. And as I mentioned back then, for those of you keeping score that night, it was one daughter, 4 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren present. That was something very special. Then I want to mention Dennis Keene, a MCHS graduate. Dennis, where are you? Okay. Dennis came to my house about 2 years ago. It was actually it was right about the time when we were about to start spraying our mail and the newspaper and our groceries with alcohol. So it you kind of know how far that was back. And he said to me, "Wow, you've done all this research." And I said, "I've always thought that we should have a plaque or something right there on the campus." He said, "Well, why haven't you done it?" And I'm not sure why I haven't done it. Maybe it could be laziness, but I don't want to stay away from that one. So anyway, within a few days, we had a meeting with Ben Dale, our past principal, and he said, "Yeah, heck yes, we should do this." So once again, that was about 1.5 years ago, and here we are today with a turnout many times more than anything that we ever could have imagined. So thank you. Then also mention Donalyn Murakauer Leopard, who worked closely on wording the plaque, and she found out how fanatical about it I was. And as I'm mentioning Donalyn, I want to mention that present here today are not only people whose grandparents were in the camps, but their parents were in the camps, and there are even a few people here today that they themselves were in the camps as children. So then to go even further, a Fox News reporter showed up to do an interview here back in June, and her grandparents were in the camp. So somehow we've gotten into the vortex here. All right. So a lot of this story surrounds the MCHS property. The Uyematsu property was much larger than just the campus here at MCHS. It was 120 acres that they owned here in Manhattan Beach. And today in Manhattan Beach, everything is measured in feet. I don't know, maybe in inches. So to give you an idea what 120 acres is, I'll just say this. From the MCHS property all the way up to 2nd Street, that would be 80 acres. Then you would need to add another half as much all the way over to Sepulveda, and that forms sort of an upside down L. That would be 120 acres. There's probably somebody here this morning that lives in Liberty Village. Anybody here from Liberty Village? Okay. Liberty Village is 80 acres. They owned something the size of not only Liberty Village, which is 400 homes, but they also owned all of Pollywog Park. That would be 120 acres over there in East Manhattan. Probably some of you have been to the Manhattan Village Mall. That's about 60 acres. It would be 2 Manhattan Village Mall areas to equal what they owned right here in the middle of Manhattan Beach from 1940 to about 1947. Okay, so we're talking about, we're not talking about somebody owns a large lot in the hill section. We're talking about somebody owns the hill section. All right, so enough of that, Sean. All right, so let's get right into the story, which is about as compelling as any story that I have ever come upon. As I like to say, Francis Uyematsu succeeded here in the United States, literally against all odds. So Francis Miyasaku Uyematsu was born in Japan and came to the United States in 1904 at the age of 22, during a peak period of Japanese immigration. Arriving in San Francisco and working for a time in Salinas, he moved south to Los Angeles, as many Japanese did, around the time of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. The 1910 U.S. Census indicated he was living in Los Angeles, and his job description was proprietor nursery. He had formed a nursery business with a partner, and although the business was successful, Uyematsu did not share his partner's enthusiasm for the retail side of it. His interest was in the import and breeding of Japanese camellias and cherry trees. Despite his preference for the more technical side of the nursery business, his biography revealed he earned upwards of $100 per day selling flowers off of a street cart in the wealthy neighborhoods around Los Angeles. This would have been where the average worker is barely making $100 in a month, and he's making that in a day. California had already earned a reputation as the epicenter of anti-Asian sentiment, having pushed the federal government to stop all Chinese immigration after 1882. There was a well-developed playbook that included local opposition by competing economic groups, publicizing physical violence, capitalizing on the racism of politicians, enacting laws that directed national attention to the problem, and followed by national legislation to deny admittance to undesirable aliens. A year after F.M. Uyematsu's arrival, the same groups that had successfully banished the Chinese had reformed as the Asiatic Exclusion League. The vast majority of the affiliated entities were labor unions. The new push had begun, and the Japanese were characterized as unassimilable, deceitful, loyal to the Japanese emperor, racially inferior, and unwilling to accept the responsibility of citizenship. The San Francisco School Board moved to segregate Japanese students from white students in 1906, even though there were only 93 Japanese students in a district of 29,000. This effort preceded President Roosevelt's Gentleman's Agreement of 1908, when restricting Japanese immigration began. By 1924, Japanese immigration was ended completely and remained that way for the next 40 years until the Immigration Act of 1965. The Japanese had replaced the Chinese as the major source of farm labor, but had quickly moved on to purchase or lease farms of their own. While never more than a single-digit percentage of acreage or farms in California, Japanese dominated what was known as truck farming, the fresh fruits and vegetables found in grocery stores. At one point, Japanese farmers produced 75% of all the strawberries in California. All this was accomplished on some of the most marginal land available. California began trying to restrict Japanese ownership of agricultural land in 1910, but it wasn't until 1913 that the first alien land law was passed, which prevented aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land or leases beyond 3 years. The law targeted Japanese farmers, although nowhere was the term Japanese even used. The law was approved overwhelmingly by the state lawmakers and tightened further in 1920 by statewide voter initiative, as we say today, propositions, and approved at that point in time by the voters in a 3-to-1 margin. The alien land law was made even more stringent in 1923 and upheld by the California Supreme Court in that same year. Many Western states modeled their alien land laws after California's. The mid-1920s through the 1930s were a relatively quiet time where land law enforcement seemed a low priority even in the California courts. That period ended abruptly with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Enforcement and forfeiture, known as cheat, actions against Japanese farm owners accelerated, with the state offering monetary incentives to municipalities that found violations. All this while at the same time 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated between 1942 and 1945. Not until 1952 were the land laws eventually invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court. In the face of anti-Japanese sentiment, racist land and immigration laws, and exclusionary citizenship, Uyematsu managed to acquire 5 acres in Montebello in 1910 and start his own star nurseries. In the 1920s, he added 10 acres in Sierra Madre and 120 acres in Manhattan Beach in 1940. Japanese immigrants sometimes acquired land in the names of their children, who were U.S. citizens by birth, or through guardianship, stock corporations, or the assistance of Caucasian partners. The Depression years had actually been very good for Uyematsu's business, as he had imported many new breeds of camellias, as well as cherry trees, from Japan just before a foreign plant embargo around 1915. He was a pioneer in new methods of breeding and cultivating flowers using temperature-controlled greenhouses, and had established himself as the Camellia King. He served on many boards and organizations throughout his career, including Southern California Japanese Chamber of Commerce, Southern California Japanese Garden Business Association, Southern California Flower Mart, the Flower Market Company, All Japan Agricultural Society Southern California Chapter, and the Southern California Shizuka Club. In 1937, he was approached by an oil company about the possibility of drilling on his Montebello nursery property. In conjunction with this event, wouldn't you know it, he was contacted by some real estate agents about a property in Manhattan Beach. The oil tests never panned out, but Uyematsu was so completely taken with the 120-acre parcel in Manhattan Beach, and his business had done so well that he purchased the entire property in 1940. He loved the property so much that a March 1941 photo of him, his wife, and 3 of his 5 children standing right on the road entering the property bore the handwritten title, Manhattan Beach Estate, 120 acres. No one could have foreseen how their lives would be changed later that same year. Even before Japan's 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, tragedy had struck the Uyematsu family. One of their sons, 16-year-old Star, died as a result of a head injury from a school playground accident. That was October 2, 1941. Then came Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entrance into World War II, and the hysteria and racism that followed, leading to Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, and the forced removal and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. I'm glad are there any English teachers in the crowd right now? That was the all-time run-on sentence. I'll tell you what, as a teacher, I'm going to kick myself right in the ass for that. They were given a relatively short period of time to decide what to do with their homes, businesses, and belongings, as many bank accounts were frozen. The very short period between Executive Order 9066 and being sent to the Pomona Assembly Center, Uyematsu was visited on February 22nd by Manchester Bodie, publisher of the Los Angeles Daily News, and Charles Jones, president of Richfield Oil Company, both amateur collectors who wished to buy camellias for their wooded estates near Los Angeles. About 300,000 plants were involved in the deal. Manchester Bodie's property was in La Cañada and known as Rancho del Descanso, later to become Descanso Gardens, with one of the most prominent collections of camellias to be found anywhere. Uyematsu, under duress, sold his prized camellias to Bodie that day. Many were unique breeds he had imported and cultivated himself. Uyematsu left the management of Star Nurseries to his accountant, while he and his family were taken to Pomona Assembly Center. Pomona Fairgrounds is really what it was. to await transfer to one of the 10 hastily constructed war relocation centers, the camps. The Uyematsu family spent 3 to 4 months at Pomona before being taken by car to between Lone Pine and Independence in the Owens Valley, about 230 miles north of LA. They were originally scheduled for relocation to Hart Mountain in Wyoming, but the family managed placement at Manzanar, the closest camp to Los Angeles, and donated 1,000 cherry trees for a park there. It was August 1942, and the Uyematsus were now family number 22772. They lived in Barracks Block 6, Building 10, Apartment 2. Their space was approximately 20 feet by 24 feet for 6 family members. Latrines and showers were communal, and meals were served in mess halls. Approximately 10,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated at Manzanar. 2/3 were U.S. citizens. Although there are many stories of how the majority of Japanese Americans lost literally everything in a short period of time through forced sales and personal business property at pennies on the dollar or outright vandalism, Uyematsu was able to hang on to his business and some properties at a substantial cost. In his biography, Uyematsu stated that although he was able to have his accountant run the business in his absence, the manager looked upon Uyematsu as an enemy alien. Soon, the very profitable business began to run significant losses. Once at Manzanar, many of the internees immediately set to work improving a desolate, wind-blown landscape into something more pleasing to the eye. Uyematsu received permission to return to Los Angeles and, using his own trucks, brought upwards of 1,000 cherry trees and some 80 wisteria to Manzanar and created what became known as Japanese Cherry Park. The park occupied 3 to 5 acres and was immediately adjacent to the Children's Village, an orphanage within Manzanar. The park, designed by landscape architect William Katsuki, had beautiful ponds and water features. Uyematsu's daughter, Marion, recalled that her father spent most days during their 3 years of detention working on the park and caring for the plants and trees. As time went by at Manzanar and Star Nursery's losses mounted, Uyematsu was forced to sell parcels of the Manhattan Beach property to raise needed funds to maintain his business. An auction for 80 acres of his property was advertised and scheduled for late January 1943, but there was no evidence one ever took place. In 1944, 3 parcels totaling 38 acres were sold to N.R. Kuhn and his family, local builders and business owners. These parcels encompassed most of the hill east of Sepulveda and north of Keats, hence Kuhn Drive. Another 20 acres north of the future Maricosta property was also sold in 1944 to a separate buyer. In June of 1945, 3 months after the Uyematsu family was released from Manzanar, a second 20 acres at the corner of Peck and 2nd Street was also sold. All that remained of Uyematsu's beloved 120-acre estate was 40 acres near the intersection of Peck Avenue and Artesia Boulevard, at that time known as Gould Lane. Hermosa, Manhattan, and Redondo Beach grew rapidly during the post-war boom, and the trustees of the Redondo Union High School District set out to find a parcel of land suitable for building a second high school in the northern end of the district. There were few parcels of sufficient size available, as developers in the post-World War II era snapped up whatever they could. The school district had budgeted $100,000 as part of a larger $1 million bond issue passed in 1946, with an eye toward acquiring suitable site for the new high school. Apparently, Uyematsu's remaining 40 acres was not formally on the market. However, N.R. Kuhn who had been on the Redondo School Board since 1943, had previously purchased some Uyematsu property in 1944 for his own development, may have had some connection. In 1947, less than 2 years after the camps were closed, and with his business still below pre-war levels, Uyematsu sold the last piece of his Manhattan property to the Redondo Union High School District for $60,000. Kuhn was quoted in the Manhattan Beach News as saying, "It was less than we had expected to pay." The school board resolution was dated February 18, 1947. The grant deed between Star Nurseries and Redondo Union High School District was recorded May 8, 1947. The land where camellias were grown that may still live at the Sconso Gardens, and where cherry trees were grown that may once have formed a beautiful park behind the barbed wire of Manzanar, was now scheduled to become the future home of Maricosta High School. Francis Miyasaku Uyematsu was now 66 years old. He had lost a son just months before Pearl Harbor and had lost his oldest daughter, Alice, age 23, to tuberculosis that she had acquired while at Manzanar. And she passed in the spring of 1947. The wonderful family picture taken on the Manhattan Beach estate must have seemed like a dream. In the 43 years since immigrating to the United States, Uyematsu had literally succeeded against all odds. He was denied a path to citizenship. He had witnessed Japanese immigration choked off completely. He had seen racist land laws with no other purpose than to throttle the Japanese passed and tightened repeatedly. He had heard a U.S. senator from California whose campaign motto was, "Keep California white." He had been unjustly incarcerated for almost 3 years, along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans, based on little more than they looked like the enemy. And he'd heard a California governor, a man who would go on to become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, say he didn't want any of the Japanese to return to California once the camps were closed. He received $25 and a bus ticket when he walked out of Manzanar. The family members would continue to run the business, but F.M. Uyematsu would retire by 1950. He continued to donate plants to public spaces and foster relationships between the U.S. and Japanese governments. He would live a long life, but not long enough to hear President Ronald Reagan apologize in 1988 for the incarceration and state it was caused by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The business would operate until 1988, continually pushed further east as communities developed and open land was valued at a premium. The final location was Ontario, California. Assemblymember Muratsuchi, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Currier, for that education. I can see why you are known as Mr. Maricosta. Mayor Stern, President Fenton, City Council members, school board members, and the entire community of Manhattan Beach, and perhaps most importantly, the students of Maricosta High School. I want to thank all of you for the invitation for me to join this very special event, because this is such a special privilege for me. You know, as you'll hear a lot of Japanese Americans talk about generations, the Issei, the Nisei, the Sansei. I'm a Sansei, third generation Japanese American, and I have the privilege of representing Manhattan Beach and the South Bay in the California legislature. But I know that I would not have this privilege but for the sacrifices of the Issei, like people like Francis Miyosaku Uematsu. You know, when I was doing my research last night about the history of the Uyematsu family, I saw that he had immigrated to the United States in 1904. My grandfather, Genjiro Muratsuchi, immigrated to the state of Idaho in 1907. Like many of the Issei, the first generation Japanese Americans, he was also a farmer. And you know, when I learned more about the struggles, you know, the racism, all the obstacles that FM Uematsu had to overcome to succeed and to make a difference in the lives of so many, you know, it really moved me. And so it is so wonderful to see the Manhattan Beach Unified School District, Dr. Bose, the school board, for voting to support this memorial that's going to be unveiled today. Because, you know, this is going to be, I mean, in this wonderful location, this is going to be part of the living history of this community. That every day the students are going to be walking by this memorial and be reminded of the history of those who came before them on this land. Speaking of those who came before them, I also wanted to give a special acknowledgement to Mary Uyematsu Kao, who's going to be representing the Uyematsu family today. I want, especially all the students here, to Google Mary Uyematsu Kao, because she is what my 12-year-old daughter would call a baddie. Mary Uyematsu Kao is a legendary activist in the Asian American community. She worked for 30 years at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. I'm a product of the Asian American Studies movement, of the ethnic studies movement. And so I feel, you know, a connection not only to the history of Francis Miyosaku Uematsu, but I feel like, you know, there's a connection through you, Mary, and to me, because this is not only a monument to teach the history of the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans in hopes that this will never occur again to any other community, but this is also a monument to the power of education to change lives. And so, again, I want to thank Maricosta High School, the Manhattan Beach Unified School District, and the entire community for coming out today in support of this wonderful monument. And thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Currier.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to invite up two of our school board members, Jen Fenton and Jen Cochran.
Good morning. Well, we can't compete with the history lesson for sure. Thank you, Mr. Currier, and for all the history lessons you've given to our students for many, many years. And the beautiful thing is that now this will be memorialized. Chuck Currier's passion for this project and the complete history of Maricosta High School goes far beyond this board or my time on the school board. However, we're all the fortunate recipients of his labor of love to record the history of Maricosta High School. You've heard the history and the fortunate connection he made to the Uyematsu family. Chuck Currier and Ben Dale brought the new proposed course called the MiraCosta History Project to the board in 2017. So he's been working on this for long before that as well. This is not a surprise. Mr. Currier, being a history teacher, would want to share this project and his love for MiraCosta with interested students. And what a gift to our district. We now have a written history of MiraCosta High School. We've made this very important connection with the Uyematsu family and now understand the history of the land where we're standing. MBUSD is a teaching and learning organization. We recognize how much we have to learn from what happened in the past. While the history of this property could have been written many different ways based on our country's history and circumstances, we're honored to know the history, to understand what happened and why, and to give us the opportunity to learn from our history. While those of us standing here today will be able to pass this history down orally, we won't always be here to do that. So it's our hope that by dedicating this plaque, by teaching this history in our classrooms, and from all of Chuck Currier's written and recorded history, the future generations of MiraCosta students and our entire community will learn from this history, honor the history of the land, celebrate the Uyematsu family, and learn from our nation's history. On behalf of the entire board and past boards and past superintendents and many of you standing here today, we're honored to support this project and are thrilled to see it come together with this dedication. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now it's my honor to introduce to you the former MiraCosta High School principal, Ben Dale.
Thank you, Dr. Gerger. If you ever needed proof that divergent personalities could do something great, let me tell you about Chuck Currier and myself. Mr. Currier, for many years, walked to school. How many miles every day?
Mile each way.
A mile each way.
Uphill both ways.
Uphill both ways. Mr. Currier, every day for many years, walked a mile and back to school. I lived behind Journey of Faith, and I drove every day. Mr. Currier's normal mode of dress of a safari hat, a backpack, cargo shorts, and hiking boots is not my cup of tea. Yet today he's wearing a suit, and I've subscribed to the former principal John Giovatti retirement attire. So thank you, Mr. Giovatti, for inspiring me. Mr. Currier is meticulous and thoughtful and precise with his words, and I'm a loose cannon. Mr. Currier teaches economics, or taught economics, and I'm generally discouraged from having anything to do with budgets, finances, or money in any way. And yet we bonded over a love of the history of the school. He talked about that meeting that we had, and prior to that meeting, I had undertaken a summer project of reading every yearbook. I read all 64 yearbooks, and I was cataloging every teacher, counselor, and administrator who had ever taught here, and the number of years they had taught here. And I put together a little list, which I passed to Mr. Faber for fact-checking. Thank you, Mr. Faber. And around that same time, Mr. Currier came in, and we had that fruitful conversation. And we bonded over that love of this school. And in one of the early yearbooks, there was a dedication to the Uyematsu family. It may have been in the first or second one, thanking them for this, for being able to put the school here. And that started our journey. And I've admired Chuck and tried to support him as best I could in that endeavor, but he definitely was the driving force behind this. And I hope that our divergent personality relationship is emblematic of what this monument should stand for, and that is bringing people together to have conversation about our history, the good and the bad. And I want to thank Mr. Currier for inspiring that in all of us. I'd like to thank the district office and the board for supporting this project. It takes real courage today as leaders to talk openly about our history, and they had the courage and the political will to do that. And I thought that that was really special. And they didn't want to sugarcoat it or cover it with a coat of paint. They said, this is our history, and let's have a conversation. And I thought that was really remarkable. And I love that that's what Maricosta High School stands for. That you can have those conversations and we can grow together. Now, one thing that I was unable to do during my time here that eats at me. Right over here, if you look, there's an extension that sticks out. See the big R? There's an extension that sticks out. That's the old language lab. And it's largely unused. I would say it's unused. Okay. Are there any foreign language teachers here today? No? Okay, it's unused. And it's a large space. And I always had a dream of turning that into a Maricosta History Museum. And I was never able to do it. Now, the problem with that type of project is it's too small for a bond, and it's too big for a budget allocation. So we need you. We need someone with equal passion to Mr. Currier to raise that money. And let's put a Maricosta History Museum there. Mr. Currier would happily be the curator. I hope I'm not revealing any confidences, but Mr. Faber once expressed to me an interest in participating in that type of project. And I tell you, if you ever want two people who will get it done, Mr. Faber and Mr. Currier, they can twist arms with the best of them. So let's get that done. I challenge you as a community, of which I'm still a member. I've moved to New Mexico, but we kept our home, which, by the way, my home sits on former Uyematsu land. So I'm proud of that, and we'll always cherish that. But I'll be the first to donate to that project, and let's get that done. And I challenge you as a community, let's do that.
Thank you, Dr. Dale. Now it's my honor to invite Mary Uyematsu up to join us to speak today.
I guess you can hear me. Okay, thank you for the nice introduction from Mr. Muratsuchi. Today we stand on the land that once belonged to my grandfather. He had a brief ownership, but one that left an indelible mark in our family history. My father, first son of F.M. Uyematsu, used to take our family on Sunday drives down the Pacific Coast Highway. Every time we neared Manhattan Beach, my mother would say, "I think I'm gonna be sick," forcing my father to turn the car around. I lived most of my life in Southern California, but the first time I actually visited Manhattan Beach as an adult was earlier this year for the Fox News story about Maricosta High, honoring my grandfather's story. This story gives us a window into a history of land theft that continues today, as we witness an unprecedented multitude of people that have been uprooted from their homes. Our homeless people are a constant reminder that there is something very wrong going on in this country, the most powerful nation in the world. I want to acknowledge the long history of stolen lands that have been committed or supported by various U.S. government entities. the original caretakers of the Los Angeles basin, long before white Europeans so-called discovered America, are the indigenous Gabrielino and Tonga peoples. This same land was taken as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, when the U.S. government defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War. All of California, Nevada, Utah, and significant parts of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Texas became U.S. territory for a mere $15 million. And those that we ironically call Mexican immigrants said it best at one of the biggest May Day demonstrations in recent history in Los Angeles, when a banner read, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." In 1938, about 10 years after the Bruces and other African American families were forced off their land through the use of eminent domain, my grandfather bought the 120 acres that was lovingly called the Uyematsu family Manhattan Beach Estate. My grandfather had found the most suitable climate here to grow his beloved cherry trees. For those of you who have seen the breathtaking scenes in Japan, when thousands of cherry trees bloom, it was Grandpa's dream to recreate scenes like that here in Southern California. He defied what people in Japan told him, that he would never be able to grow cherry trees in Southern California climate. It was cherry trees that were growing here on his Manhattan Beach estate that were moved to Manzanar concentration camp to create Manzanar's Cherry Park. From 1953 to 1956, my grandfather donated 60 cherry trees of 18 different varieties, some as old as 20 years, to the city of Los Angeles. They were planted at Bronson Canyon and Griffith Park. Like the happy father of the bride that I donated and transplanted my cherry trees to Los Angeles. Among the trees I gave were ones I had prized highly through the years. Ones that caused my wife to come running out of the house when she saw me digging them up and asking me in astonishment, "Oh, are you giving that one up too?" With a prayer that the cherry trees I donated will grow ever luxuriantly through the years to come, displaying the beauty which makes their blossoms queen of flowers in Japan, standing as a memorial to the Issei long after they are gone from this world, and fulfilling their responsibility of beautifying this city. I laid down my pen. Sadly, the LA City Parks did not have the expertise or maybe even the priority to keep these trees alive. After a few bountiful years, they shriveled up and died. Not long after Japanese Americans returned from the concentration camps of World War II, and as the African American struggle for civil and human rights rocked the nation, Japanese Americans were held up as the model minority. It was a statement to black activists, militant black activists, to be more like the Japanese. Just work hard and be quiet, and you can be successful just like the Japanese. Hardly the case. I bring this up because in today's racial climate, and with the return of Bruce's Beach to its rightful owners, there will likely be those who point to this monument in an attempt to negotiate down what gets returned to the Bruce descendants, because that is still in process. At best, please allow this monument to my grandfather to be a reminder of the many land grabs and outright thievery that has been committed on all peoples of color in the name of the U.S. government. We need to work together and not allow ourselves to be pitted against each other in the many fights for restitutions reparations, and retributions at hand. In closing, the Uyematsu family is very thankful to Mr. Chuck Currier for his many years of work and dedication and courage to do this project. I'd also like to thank students Maya Hernandez and Mia Murakami Cho, who interviewed me as part of this project, and Lindsay Fox for her powerful video on this story. And also Professor Wendy Cheng, who's sitting right here, who researched on my grandfather's camellias that graced Descanso Gardens today. Please Google Wendy Cheng. I wish to thank my Aunt Mare, the last surviving child of FM, my sister Amy, who started researching Grandpa long before I did, and to George Floyd and the countless victims of police murder that ignited the massive Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It is these massive movements that open the way for changes in our country, where racism and economic injustice is deeply embedded in the bedrock. Thank you, Maricosta High School and the Manhattan Beach School Board for funding this monument, and to all the future students who will learn from these bits of American history that never find their way into school textbooks. Thank you again very much.
We have a few members of our Asian American Club who'd like to present you with some flowers.
So, on behalf of State Senator Ben Allen's office, we have a certificate of recognition for Francis Miyasaku Uyematsu, and I'm going to deliver this to you.
I'd also like to invite up Al Muratsuchi.
Thank you again. I first want to, again, express my sincere appreciation to Chuck Currier, Mr. Maricosta, and in recognition of all of your leadership, your efforts, your love for this high school and this community. I want to present you with this certificate of recognition.
I may start doing one a year.
And of course, to the baddie, Amy Uyematsu, and representing the Uyematsu family in recognition of all your activism and your education to change lives. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Currier.
So before we unveil the historical plaque and monument, I want to go ahead and read so that everybody knows exactly what is on the plaque when we uncover it. So the plaque reads, Francis Miyasaku Uyematsu, Camellia King. It says, Miracosta sits on land previously owned by the Uyematsu family, whose patriarch arrived in California in 1904. Despite fierce anti-Asian sentiment and racist restrictions on land ownership and citizenship, 22-year-old F.M. Uyematsu successfully imported and bred Japanese camellias and cherry trees. Over 40 years, he expanded Star Nurseries to 3 locations, including 120 acres in Manhattan Beach, pioneered temperature-controlled greenhouses, and earned the nickname Camellia King. After Japan's 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, as the U.S. government prepared to forcibly remove and incarcerate 120,000 Japanese Americans, Uyematsu, with few available options, sold 300,000 of his prized camellias under duress. Interned at Manzanar, the family donated 1,000 cherry trees for a park there, which Uyematsu cultivated throughout his years in camp. During detention, Uyematsu had to sell most of his Manhattan Beach land to sustain his business. In 1947, 2 years after the camps were closed, and with his business still below pre-war levels, Uyematsu sold the last 40 acres of his Manhattan Beach land to the Redondo Union High School District for $60,000. And then it says, dedicated March 31st, 2020.
We'd love to invite the family up to come and unveil the plaque.
It'll be a better photo op if we're all behind. Yeah. Well, we can all, we weren't able to rehearse this. Sure. Yeah. She's on the
Thank you so much for coming today. We so appreciate your attendance, and it's just so wonderful to see so many people coming out to support the Uyematsu family and this dedication. Thank you for being here today, and please enjoy treats on your way out. Have a great day.